PowerPoint's queued up. Dare I ask? I called this deep history. It's actually early history of ideas of scientific racism. And we're a very distinguished panel. I want to give introductions quickly so we save time for the talks and for you. A few of our, sorry, here we go again. Sorry about that. Hello again. Welcome to anyone who came in a little after the rest did. This panel, it takes us into the 18th as well as 19th century. Our first speaker is Evelynn Hammonds, distinguished, sort of gold standard of this subject in so many ways. She's the Barbara Gutmann Rosenkrantz Professor of History of Science and African and African American Studies at Harvard. She's also in the School of Public Health at Harvard. As many of you know, a lot of us have a lot of appointments. It's not always clear how we do this, but we try. She was Senior Vice Provost in the Faculty of Development and Diversity at Harvard. Does Harvard still use the word diversity? Some places, I shouldn't have asked that, but there we are. And she also served as Dean of the Harvard College of the Harvard College of the History of Science. She has studied everything from disease, race, and science to HIV/AIDS, and especially the whole broad subject of health disparities and race. She works along the intersections of science, medicine, socio-political meanings of that. And she's currently director of the Project on Race and Gender in Science and Medicine at the Hutchins Center for African American Studies. Natalie Lira studies the politics of reproduction and the history of medicine. She did her PhD at the University of Michigan in American culture. She especially is interested in the politics of reproduction and in particular sterilization. Her book is entitled Laboratory of Deficiency, Sterilization and Confinement in California, about which we heard so much last night. And she also works particularly with and about people of Mexican origin and eugenic sterilization. She's co-director of the Sterilization and Social Justice Lab at SCJL. Rana Hogarth did her PhD here at Yale in history and the history of science. John Warner, her mentor, is here in the room. I was on Rana's committee. It's wonderful to have you back, Rana. She's now a professor of history and sociology of science at the University of Pennsylvania. Her first book is entitled Medicalizing Blackness, Making Racial Difference in the Atlantic World, 1780, 1840. She's one of the best scholars we have now of race, science, and slavery. And so this panel, I'm going to turn it over to now. Each is going to take about 10 to 12 minutes, and then we save good time for the discussion with you. You came here to be heard. Welcome. Evelynn, you're first.
Thank you.
I'm afraid we have to use this, right? Okay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you, Dan, and everyone here at the Gilder Lehrman Center for bringing this event together. And good morning. Good morning. So in this panel, we were asked to comment on how the race concept shaped scientific knowledge production in the 18th and 19th century, and why that history is important for understanding contemporary racial inequities. So I work largely on the history of race concepts and scientific racism in the United States, specifically in medicine, anthropology, ethnology, and biology in the 19th century. And so this is, in many respects, a place where I believe that much of our contemporary issues with health disparities emerges out of what was happening in this long 19th century period. And so other thing I want to do is begin by talking about some work we've been doing recently at Harvard. So I, along with other historians of medicine, also with the medical anthropologists and sociologists, have embarked on a project commissioned by the editors of the New England Journal of Medicine to produce a series under the title Racism, Medicine, and the New England Journal Since 1812, The Historical Roots of Injustice in Medicine. The journal editors recognize that in the past, quote, the journal and other medical institutions have in the past justified and advocated the mistreatment of groups on the basis of their race, ethnicity, religion, sex or gender, sexual orientation, and physical or mental conditions. And so since the journal is now digitized through its entire run, fortunately, graduate students don't have to suffer what I suffered living in the basement of Countway Library for many years. Now you can sit at your desk in comfort. What we did is look through the entire run of the New England Journal of Medicine, and particularly looking at during the period of slavery in the long 19th century, what was published in there. This is a time when journal articles were not peer-reviewed, in a sense. The editors pretty much picked what was published. And so we were very interested in following those articles. This work, in some respects, grew out of the Harvard and Legacy of Slavery report in 2022, which included a chapter titled Legacies of Slavery and Scholarship, Race Science. And this chapter focused in part on the well-known figures, the biologist and comparative zoologist Louis Agassiz, the physician and founder of the New England Journal and Harvard Medical School professor of anatomy, Jeffries Wyman, also at the Harvard Medical School. And the historians working on this chapter quickly realized that there was so much more archival work to do to understand the role of race science in the history of Harvard Medical School. But alongside that, the ways in which the medical school is connected to the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology, of which you have one here at Yale, and the Museum of Comparative Zoology. They were all founded in the 19th century, and they were all connected and linked to legacies of slavery, colonialism, and imperialism, both in the United States and around the world. And now, though much is known about Agassiz, few people at Harvard and outside of it knew that John Collins Warren and Jeffries Warren, both at the medical school, and the museum leaders that followed them were deeply engaged in the project of racial science. In other words, much of Harvard's and many of the other older medical schools in this country gained their preeminence in the 19th century by focusing on defining, studying, and educating medical and science students in the theories and practices of racial science. And sadly, those practices extend to this present day. I will echo what was just spoken about in that we have to do a serious re-education project in medical curricula to undo and untangle a lot of what became normative in medical teaching over this time. So let me see if I can do the PowerPoint. Didn't change. I don't have to use it, but here it comes. Just trying to. There you go. Okay. Now to go? Okay, wait. This one. This one. Okay, thank you. So this is just a list of some of the articles that we've worked on, that I've been working on for the last few years. There's the Slavery in the Journal, Reckoning with History and Complicity, the Explaining Inequities, the Enduring Legacy of Historical Biases, and a more recent one that's in press on John Collins Warren, journal founder, institutional builder, and racial theorist. So I don't want to talk about this slide so much because I think we all, I think there's a general understanding of it, but just one part, the first definition. It's often used, racial science is often used without precise definition by many scholars, but it's generally meant to mean the constellation of studies which emerged and evolved in the 19th century that conceptualized race in terms of anatomy, morphology, typology, differential immunity, and susceptibility to disease and hierarchy. The idea that there were major anatomical, physiological, psychological, and cultural differences between blacks and white was commonly accepted by physicians throughout the 19th century. And starting in the colonial period moving forward, white physicians assiduously cataloged those differences. When I say assiduously catalog, I mean I don't have enough room in my office for all the papers of all these cataloging of all these racial differences. That's how common it was. And I often begin with just a quick look in my classes at Thomas Jefferson and his notes on the state of Virginia in 1787. And he, of course, says in that piece, the first difference which strikes us is that of color. The difference is fixed in nature and is as real as if its seat and cause were better known to us. They have less hair and face on the body. They secrete less by the kidneys and more by the glands of the skin, which gives them a very strong and disagreeable odor. They seem to require less sleep. Another example, which many of you will know about, is the great Samuel Cartwright. I call him great, that's in quotes. His report on the disease and peculiarities of the Negro race. And I want to show you these slides quickly because you may not know when I say comparative analysis, what actually they are saying in some of these papers. So Cartwright is a famous one, 1851. The color of the skin is the main difference. The membranes, the muscles, the tendons, and all fluids and secretions. There's a difference in the flesh. The bones are wider and harder. The neck is shorter and more oblique. The spine more inward. The pelvis more outward. The thigh bone larger. The bones more bent. The legs curve outwards. The feet are flat. The heel so long as to make it appear as if planted in the middle of the foot. The broad, flat nose, thick lips, woolly hair. But his hearing is better. The sense of smell more acute and slightly stronger than the white man's. Bears the sun better, veins small. And and Cartwright goes on to speak to the question that Douglas spoke to in his very wonderful paper. He says, the question may be asked, does he belong to the same race as the white man? Is he a son of Adam? Does his peculiar physical conformation stand in opposition to the Bible, or does it prove its truth? Then, of course, you can go up to Rudolf Matas. Now we're in 1884. So we start Jefferson, 1787, Cartwright, 1850s, and then Matas in the 1890s. I mean, so there's a long arc of these things. I just wanted to show you 3 points along that arc. So Matas says the eye had more intense pigmentation. The ear canal was larger and straighter, the nose wider. The skin was thicker, but otherwise only different from whites in the quantity and general distribution of melanin rather than in quality. No differences in simple wound infections. Cancer, formerly rare but increasing. The single difference, which was of a specific racial character, was the kinky wool hair. In women of African descent, Matas found that the well-known characteristics of the Hottentot Venus were rapidly disappearing in the American Negro. Physiological differences consisted of the off-sided, lessened sensibility of the nervous system of the Negro to pain and shock. And then that takes us to a recent article that many people have been citing lately, published in the National Academy, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2016. This is a study that 4 scholars at the University of Virginia did to understand the relationship between pain, racial bias, and the treatment of black patients. They talked to lay people as well as medical students, but they asked the participants whether they believed that black people have thicker skin and are more susceptible to heart disease, are more fertile, and have denser and stronger bones, and more sensitive nerve endings. And this study is being quoted because it reveals the ways in which these future doctors in 2016 harbored medical stereotypes of black patients at alarming rates, and particularly appealing to medical students, they found in the study, that were notions like black people possess stronger bones and thicker skin. 2 false anatomical traits that were popularized during the 19th century. The issue is that these ideas are popularized, but rather that's too, I think, facile a way of thinking about it. The idea that blacks have stronger bones and thicker skin is deeply embedded in medical theory, practice, and education, okay? Such that, many years after Matas and these people are writing about this work in the 19th century, medical students a few years ago are still quoting that kind of stereotype with no sense of the need to question it. And I think that's what's really important. So we know that historians agree that biology, ethnology, and anthropology were the disciplines organized around the study of man beginning in the 19th century. And as such, the origins of human groups, the classification of those groups into races, and variation between those races were major foci of research. The fields of medicine and public health, anatomy, physical anthropology were also major arenas for the study of race and racial differences in this period. Indeed, throughout the 19th century, physicians, anatomists, public health experts, and anthropologists produced most of the research on the scientific aspects of race in the United States. More importantly, these fields conceptualized race as an integrated physical, linguistic, and cultural totality. And this started in the 19th century and continued in the 20th century, though there's lots of debate about this among historians and sociologists and anthropologists. But physicians' willingness to embrace and promote the idea of racial differences and racist ideas bolstered societal preoccupations with racial hierarchies. And the medical literature normalized and often justified racism. So these practices that physicians were engaged in the 19th century of this constant comparison served to define both what the Negro was and what white was. It is the ways in which the logic of race in the United States culture anchors whiteness in the epistemology of black skin. And so this process, these practices, I call them comparative racial analysis. It's a representational system that mediated social relations, constantly addressing those relations indirectly, offering ways to reassess, manage, and diffuse conflicts about the morality of slavery, or whites' anxieties about miscegenation, or the need for segregation in the post-slavery period, to name just a few examples. So this comparative project that continues inscribed a logic of difference as a defining aspect of race in medicine. And so it's not the same project over this long period, but many of the elements persist over time. And racial comparison defined and reified the notion of racial types, even when this concept was undermined by developments in genetics and anthropology in the 20th century. Racial comparisons emphasize that individuals stood for types, and as a result, individual physical characteristics and group characteristics are often conflated. And such comparisons not only ignored, but foreclosed the question of variability within as well as between racial categories, which also rendered these categories static, closed, and immutable. Such comparisons themselves kept in place the belief that race was a permanent biological aspect of humans, denoted by the very use of the categories of Negro and white, which change over time in our senses, as you know. But by the 20th century, these terms were so entrenched in medicine, anatomy, public health, and anthropology, and biology that few attempted to even define the race concept, nor explicate its internal or external validity. And so, by the end of the 20th century, the medical and anthropological literature is filled with critiques of studies of racial differences. None of these critiques objects to the project of racial comparison itself. Rather, people talk about their problems due to biases in research methods or interpretation of results, or the lack of good technologies to capture what is different between these human groups. And I have to say, evidence of race prejudice abounds in the medical literature. By the end of the 19th century, there is hardly a body part that has not been subjected to comparative racial analysis. And that goes on up into the present. I'm on the train coming down here yesterday. There's a report on the radio where it says African American women are talking about the experience of endometriosis and how they were ignored. And the comment that one woman made, she said, she was told that you're a black woman, but endometriosis is a white woman's disease. So you should go home and take Tylenol. This was a direct quote. What year is this? Okay, so the notion that black bodies and white bodies are innately, fundamentally different is so sediment into medical education and practice. It's going to take a lot to pull this apart and get people to understand where these ideas emerged from, how they became so embedded, and the ways in which they support popular notions of racial difference in this society. So those are the points I wanted to make. There's a lot more to say. And certainly in the historical work, there's been recently I say by the year since about the year 2000, numbers of journals have been examining their past and the ideas that they perpetuated uncritically. Nature Genetics said that they were concerned about the fact that they had not been critical about comparative racial analysis in genetic research, and they had to address that. So also, even before then, as recently as 1992, in JAMA, the editors acknowledged that while publications about comparative racial research numbered in the thousands, the concept of race is at best elusive. Thank you.
Okay. All right. I'm going to try and karaoke this. So I'm just going to get my slides up. Good morning. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes. Fabulous. Okay. So I'm going to do many things. I'm going to take us from the era of slavery to the era of eugenics, i.e. the early 20th century. So that's a lot of time. Sorry. A lot of this is going to be a little bit like truncated, but I'll do my best. Which way to advance? That way. Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. So I actually want to say thank you, first of all, for being able to participate in this conference. I'm here with so many people that I greatly admire, people who have been role models to me, talking about you, Evelynn. And so I am very honored just to be here and to share this panel space. So I want to say a little bit about the idea of making embodied differences from the era of slavery to the era of eugenics. And I'm actually going to talk a little bit about my prior work and also my current work, which is on eugenics. And what I fundamentally want to tell you today is that I believe that slavery era ideas related to racial fitness, endurance, intelligence, and abilities of people with African ancestry actually laid the groundwork for eugenics. So I'm basically naming eugenics as a scientific discipline that was a direct beneficiary of slavery era ideologies about race. And some of those ideologies are certainly polygenesis. So by taking this view, I'm probably upsetting very traditional folks who think about eugenics as a purely new or reactionary science. I do not think that it is. I actually think that eugenics owes much to the former slave societies of the Americas, including the United States and Anglophone Caribbean. I think those are the places where eugenicists actually went and collected data. In fact, there were places where they went and collected data. But I want us to start with slavery and why I think eugenics is this direct beneficiary of slavery era ideologies. This isn't a very well-known quote. This is from Dr. Collins, who was a plantation owner and a physician. And he is noted for writing this practical rules for the management and medical treatment of Negro slaves in the sugar colonies. I should say I will be using some archaic language like Negro and or mulatto. My use of these terms is not an endorsement. It's just the historical context. So what Collins says is, quote, besides, there are many striking variations between the temperaments of the whites and those of the Negroes, sufficient almost to induce a belief of a different organization, which the knife of the anatomist, however, has never been able to detect. And it should be clear that folks like Jefferson totally read the works of race theorists. They embrace this kind of idea that surely there are these differences in there, right? We can't maybe see them yet, but we know they're there, and we're going to continue to believe that they're there. So what I want to do in this talk today is to kind of consider this centuries-long impulse among white scientists and naturalists and physicians to see in people with African ancestry peculiarity and inferiority. Collins's views were just the tip of the racist iceberg. There was no shortage of medical writings about people of African descent susceptibility, vitality, physical and intellectual traits, and this is usually in the form of sweeping generalizations or speculative musings you might find. These comments actually made me question the scientific logic behind the myth of embodied racial differences and made me curious about how that idea would apply to people with mixed ancestry, so with people with Black and white ancestry. So my curiosity led me to race-crossing studies that took place in the Americas. They were spearheaded by American eugenicists like Charles Davenport, who's pictured here. And to be clear, eugenics, I argue, at its inception, was inherently hostile to non-normative bodies, which includes Black people's bodies. Eugenicists relied on anti-Black prejudice and viewed Blackness as a legible, physiological, and phenotypic trait that marked people as superior or inferior. So to be clear, this desire to lend precision to how phenotypical traits were inherited and to apply probability and statistics in plant and animal breeding, which is certainly what Davenport did, is just one way that eugenics emerged. I would argue that you can have two things at once, which is also that there are claims about Black people's supposedly inferior bodies that actually influence eugenicists. So Davenport got his work, he was a zoologist trained at Harvard. He was interested in animal breeding, but he also conducted extensive race-crossing studies. So this is what I mean when I say you can be interested in both. So Davenport was a leading eugenicist in the United States. He trained eugenic field workers on how to go into the homes of mixed-race people and collect intimate data, i.e. having his field workers measure their skin, ask impertinent questions about their family histories, to record data on racial mixture. Now, in many ways, this is naturally a story of scientific racism, which is what eugenics is. And I think we need to link together histories of science with histories of slavery. I think that the scientific fascination with Black and mixed race people's bodies cannot be disentangled from slavery. In fact, slavery essentially shapes the landscape of racial mixture and the scientific discourses around race mixing that emerged because of it. Slavery facilitated the violent context in which racial mixture took place in the Americas. Slavery nurtured the taxonomies associated with distinctive racial groups and the cultural construction of mixed race bodies. And long after its demise, the vestiges of slavery continue to shape the contours of an individual's cultural and racial identities. And as I argue in this paper, slavery shaped eugenic research. Eugenicists borrowed heavily from scientific ideas from the era of slavery that understood Blackness as not only a category for types of humans, but also a constellation of discrete bodily features and dispositions that carried social and biological weight. These assumed ideas about Black people's bodies did not dissipate when slavery ended. They had been enshrined in medical and scientific texts. Now, eugenicists had already been exposed to these assumptions, even if they only appeared incidentally in their writings. I'm talking about you, Sir Francis Galton, who's pictured here. This is his Hereditary Genius. He coined the word eugenics in 1883, but as you can see, Hereditary Genius was published in 1869. This is roughly 12 years before the official coinage. And Galton had pondered the problem of improving human racial stock, and he noted some very specific views about Black people's inferior intelligence. Now, I'm not saying that Galton was at first interested in Black people, but he certainly embraced this widespread belief that Black people had a naturally low mental acuity. Quote, "Among the number of Negroes of them whom we shall call half-witted men is very large, Every book alluding to Negro servants in America is full of instances. I myself was much impressed by this fact during my travels in Africa. The mistakes the Negroes made in their own matters were so childish, stupid, and simpleton-like as frequently to make me ashamed of my own species, end quote. So Galton clearly had it in for Black people before he started on the formula coining of eugenics in 1883. I find it quite interesting that he acquired information about Black people's intelligence by citing references to, quote, Negro servants in America. Now, he doesn't have that many statements on Black people per se, but this anti-Black bias is ripe and it is there, and it is in need of more scholarly explanation. In the very least, it shows us how Galton understood mental fitness as a racial trait. But we can actually move beyond Galton and consider other preoccupations with racial fitness that took place in the United States around a similar time frame. We could actually think about the Union Army's systematic measurements of Black, white, and mixed-race troops during the Civil War to see an early fixation with racial fitness emerge. The Union Army's Sanitary Commission measurements of Black and mixed-race troops' bodies for comparison to whites during the Civil War contributed to an already growing body of knowledge about race that was decidedly Black in its orientation. So this, of course, has been alluded to, what is being taught at Harvard, at medical school, at UPenn. All of these medical schools have teaching about racial anatomy, about racial differences. Well, here is the Union Army reinforcing that. The Union Army here, this is Form EE. This is basically collection of data for troops, and you can see that they reference a mulatto. They talk about his mother being possibly a quadroon. They talk about his intelligence. But this is, again, just the tip of the iceberg. The Union Army's measurements would actually emerge as investigations of the military and anthropological statistics of American soldiers in 1869. And that publication was indeed a clearinghouse of data on comparative racial fitness and was, not surprisingly, actually cited by eugenicists. And here I just want to draw your attention to the Negro questionnaire. This was actually sent out during the war under Benjamin Woodward in about 1865. This is just a stock template here, but it says the U.S. Sanitary Commission are instituting inquiries in a scientific point of view as to the physiological status of the Negro as compared with white soldiers. You will see that they have a list of questions that needed to be filled out, one of them being the effects of amalgamation on the vital endurance and vigor of the offspring. So, as the Union engaged in a war to end slavery, it engaged in a project that would validate the idea of Black physical peculiarity and biological inequality of the races. A perhaps unintended and certainly understudied consequence of this was providing the foundation for future studies of race traits, their heritability in racial crosses. So Davenport would later take up an earnest interest in the study of mixed-race people, including anthropometric study, and he actually directly cites Benjamin Gould, who was the actuary who actually oversaw this particular study and data collection effort. So turning to Davenport, we might think about how he actually collected data. I know there's questions about how and what kind of studies. So when Davenport studied race crossing, he claimed that it was very hard for him to get this data from families in the South. He felt that people were not forthcoming, and of course with good reason, considering this was the early 20th century. So what he did is he decided he would go to the Anglophone Caribbean. Which he felt was characterized by a Black and white binary. Now, this is, of course, complete fiction. By the time Davenport was going into islands like Jamaica, which is in the early 20th century, it was a multiracial space. South Asian and Chinese indentured laborers had arrived in the British Caribbean islands after slavery's demise, complicating this idea of a Black binary. As early as 1854, a small number of Chinese people had arrived in Jamaica, with larger numbers arriving between 1900 and 1940. I suspect that Davenport deliberately minimized data collection on these populations because he wanted to create a science fiction, a tale of racial intermixture that was geared towards an American audience that fit their anxieties around Black and white racial intermixture. But here we are still in former slave societies. So we have the United States, we have the Anglophone Caribbean that share this history of slavery, which means they share this history of interracial sex, which generally took place involving white men and enslaved Black women. Now, for Davenport, he really couldn't talk about this explicitly. So what he did is he essentially gestured towards this idea by suggesting that Black women were the root of these problems. But I have to say Davenport wasn't particularly original in this. He followed, of course, from Edward Long. This is in his History of Jamaica, where Edward Long offers a schematic of nomenclature and explains racial intermixture. This is from 1774. You will find that there are the taxonomies of a terceron, a quateron, a quinteron. You will notice, though, that the origin point is the Negro venter, which is a reference to the black woman's womb. Davenport could not mention white men in his discussion. So you can see Edward Long is at least realistic, as much as he can be considered realistic, as he notes that white men are responsible for this. You will find, though, that Davenport could not do that. In fact, when he publishes Race Crossing in Jamaica in 1929, he purports to show a family tree and purports to show how you have light-skinned offspring from a dark mother and a white father. And in fact, he actually says, he asks his assistant to get genealogical data involving, quote, mulatto children in which the mother is of full black blood or nearly so, and the father white, end quote. It's a strange family tree when you're missing one of the parents. What you see here are the dark-skinned mothers, relatively dark-skinned mothers. They're light-skinned babies, and there is no white father to be seen at all. Now, I think of this as an interesting riff on the slavery-era concept of partus sequitur ventrum, which dictated that the offspring of an enslaved woman and free man would always take the identity of the more subordinate parent, the mother. Now, this, of course, benefited white male slave owners. These photographs benefit the, quote, absent white father that shield him from the realities of his role of race crossing, at least for the American audiences. I'd also like to draw your attention to other ways in which eugenicists relied on slavery-era ideas of capturing difference. You see here, these are pictures of hair, mixed-race hair that I secured at the American Philosophical Society. See INI afterwards to learn more. And indeed, what this represents, though, is a way in which blackness could be collapsed and captured as a feature. This is something that, again, we turn to Edward Long, who is one of the first people in the Anglophone Caribbean to make this kind of statement about mixed race hair. Quote, they seem to partake more of the white than the black. The hair has a natural curl, and in some of it resembles the Negro fleece. But in general, it is of a tolerable length. And here is just this is from the Eugenic Records Office, a collection of mixed race people's hair that Davenport and his researchers would have had access to make their pronouncements about racial mixture. Now, I want to just quickly, in my last few minutes, say a little bit about what happens when we think about eugenics and how this knowledge gets translated. So I couldn't resist. Since I'm back here, I figured I'd do what anyone does, and that's read the Yale Daily News from the early 20th century. Why not? And so what I actually found is that eugenicists that hung out with Davenport, colleagues, friends, collaborators, include figures like Frederick Hoffman, who is noted for his 1896 race traits and tendencies of the American Negro, which he claimed that black people and mixed race people would become extinct. He was wrong, but Yale still invited him to give a series of public health lectures on questions like racial pathology, specifically race pathology of the Negro. So Davenport and Hoffman didn't actually share the same views, but Davenport did agree that hybridized people were, quote, badly put together and ineffective. So to conclude, concepts like embodied racial difference, racial fitness, and vitality are familiar to us as buzzwords that eugenics relied on to drum up support for the movement in the early 20th century. But these concepts were also rooted in a brand of anti-black race science and racial logic that flourished during the era of slavery. The logic that led to the inquiry about the vitality of racially mixed people found in that form I showed you from the Civil War remains similar to the logic that eugenicists invoked as they fretted over the fitness of undesirable immigrants. In other words, early racial data collection efforts on black, white, and mixed race people were part of a normalizing discourse that future eugenicists participated in, where it appeared reasonable to compare, quote, racial stocks and study racial hybrids. In sum, I have foregrounded the role of slavery-era race-making and scientific and medical racism as a way of thinking about the rise of eugenics. We may start to think of eugenics as less a reactionary science and more an articulation of a long process of race-making that has evolved in scientific and medical writing over time. Thank you.
the way, the Yale Daily News. The Yale Daily News was a terrific source for us in the Yale and Slavery book, I can assure you. In ways, you partially want to know. On time.
Thank you. Oh. All right, I'm gonna actually have to switch since I'm online over here. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Yeah, because I'm online here, so. Oh, thank you. All right. Oh. All right. Let me get out of the way. All right. Thanks, everyone. I want to echo the sentiment of gratitude to conference organizers and my esteemed co-presenters. All right. Now that we're all set up. Hello. Good morning. Thank you for being here. So today I am going to highlight how the science of eugenics, which we learn was developed in the late 19th century and really took hold in the United States by the early 20th century, drew on both race and disability to make assertions about who was worthy of freedom and bodily and reproductive autonomy. And I'm going to do that through the case study of California, which we learned yesterday during the film screening is a really important case study, given that the state performed 20,000 out of the estimated 60,000 eugenic sterilizations that occurred between 1907 and 1970s. So about a third of all eugenic sterilizations that occurred nationwide occurred in California. And my research really centers one specific Southern California institution that implemented eugenic sterilization, which is pictured in this photo here, called Pacific Colony. And this is where thousands of people, mainly youth, were confined and sterilized under eugenic laws. And I want to start by underscoring that part of the allure of eugenics, which we heard earlier, is that it pushed a very simplistic logic about the relationship between heredity, behavior, and society that was easily communicated to the public and is represented in this image of a poster that was shared at public eugenics fair, and that used the technology of flashing lights to indicate that the rate of reproduction of people with, quote, bad heredity was outpacing the rate of reproduction of people with heredity that made them, quote, fit for leadership, and that this was causing an economic burden such that every 15 seconds, $100 of your hard-earned money was going to the, quote, care of persons with bad heredity, including the, quote, insane, feeble-minded, criminals, and other defectives. And so eugenicists come up with various methods to address this, including immigration restriction and also sterilization and institutionalization. And so I think, the success of eugenic logic is really seen in the widespread use and acceptance of eugenic sterilization, which by the mid-1930s, about 30 states had adopted and passed their own eugenic sterilization laws following the Supreme Court's decision in Buck v. Bell in 1927. And again, California is a leader in this effort. So in this image, we have a table that really shows how in every state with a eugenics sterilization law, the legal and medical criteria for state-mandated sterilization revolved around disability labels, right? And so we see this diagnosis of feeble-mindedness. In most states, we also see insanity, epilepsy, quote, mental defectiveness. And so none of these states explicitly name the people who were ultimately, disproportionately confined and sterilized. It doesn't say we're going to do this to poor people, we're going to do this to people of color, promiscuous women, immigrants. Instead, eugenicists use disability as this ideological linchpin to validate this notion of racial difference and racial hierarchy, and to justify violence against what becomes a very large group of people. And so, as the chart indicates, one of the main disability labels used to justify sterilization and confinement in state institutions was this label of feeble-mindedness. And in California, Stanford researcher Louis Terman was one of the main elaborators of this concept. And so Terman, along with his peers across the nation, developed a theory of intelligence, which is already a very subjective concept, as something that's largely inherited, and that is hereditary, and that is static, so it can't be developed over time. Most people's intelligence level stays the same. Importantly, he also works on developing ways to measure intelligence through testing that resulted in IQ scores, mental age scores. And an important assumption within this theory was that intelligence was tied to behavior, and specifically that low intelligence, signaled by this label of feeble-mindedness, led to unwanted behaviors. So it led to poverty, led to crime, led to immorality. And so, because of this, determining people's intelligence was a really important endeavor, and it could be used in a lot of different spaces in education and labor, and importantly, could also be used and should be used to determine who should and should not reproduce, right? Because it's hereditary. So Terman spells all of this out very explicitly in his research, and I wanted to kind of point to this one example, a publication in the journal Schools and Society from 1917, and these are kind of his concluding points, right? And so he says, that feeble-mindedness is one of the most important factors to a whole source of ills, criminality, alcoholism, disease, right? And because of this, the condition represents this enormous economic burden on the state of California, but these are arguments that eugenicists are making across the country. And that burden comes in the way of funding social services, funding crime prevention, setting up courts, et cetera, et cetera. And lastly, that because the majority of these cases are hereditary, the, quote, hopeful method of curtailing the spawn of degeneracy would be to provide for what he called care, what he described as care, during the reproductive period. And so he really framed the feeble-mindedness as this existential population crisis. Terman even wrote that, quote, "If we would preserve our state for a class of people worthy to possess it, we must prevent as far as possible the propagation of mental degenerates," end quote. And actually, in this particular piece, he's advocating for the construction of what becomes Pacific Colony. So he's telling the state, don't spend money on social services. That's a waste. That's going to support the survival of this dangerous, unworthy class. Instead, invest in my IQ score testing empire, invest in the construction of state institutions to confine people, invest in the practice of sterilization. And so I want to show here how race comes into the picture and highlight what legal scholar Dorothy Roberts has asserted, which is that eugenics did not transcend the American racial order. It was fed, nurtured, and sustained by racism, and what Rana, really showed in her presentation, right? And so what eugenics really does is, and why it becomes so convincing, is that it provided data and scientific evidence for already existing ideas about the incompetence of poor people. It validated, these racist and nativist ideas about people of color and immigrants, and also justifies ableism. And so it perhaps is not surprising that based on his IQ testing of populations in California, Terman would go on to assert that feeble-mindedness was, quote, very, very common among Mexican origin and Black people in the Southwest, and that, quote, dullness was racial or inherent. And this is in his 1916 publication, The Measurement of Intelligence, which was the tool, the manuscript that instructed people on how to use his intelligence scale. So this idea is really built into that tool. Terman's graduate student, J. Harold Williams, took up this assertion and was determined to collect more data on this idea, and in which he published in the 1920 issue of the Journal of Delinquency, wherein he asserted again that Black and Mexican origin youth show more tendency to delinquency than white children, and that this was due to their low intelligence, right? And then this trickles into the school system. And here, this last quote is by Mary Bees Henry, who was the director of research at the Santa Ana Public Schools, who repeats this assertion that Mexican children are inferior due not to language, but to a, quote, real native inferiority. And so this is kind of pushed back to criticism that these IQ testings, these measurements of intelligence were skewed because of language barriers, right? And so she's saying, no, it's not that, right? And so, again, I want to highlight, right, that this research was about biologizing and justifying already existing inequalities, to construct an argument that the reason that people are poor, the reason that people are overrepresented in the criminal court system is not, racism, it's not unequal social institutions, but it's because of their own inferiority. And with that scientific data, state authorities, eugenicists lobby state authorities successfully to implement what become very violent interventions in institutions like Pacific Colony. And so by the mid-1920s, Terman and his colleagues get to celebrate the fruits of their labor. And this is when Pacific Colony opens. People laud it as this great humanitarian project, as the state's most scientific approach to addressing large social issues, to addressing poverty, to addressing crime. And it's really, what it becomes is this eugenic laboratory, right? Where eugenicists could realize their vision through what becomes like a three-part approach, which they deem and describe as care, right? And so the first being segregation through institutionalization, what sociologist Nicole Rafter labels prophylactic institutionalization. So first step is, confine people during the reproductive period, right? I'll note that much of my research finds that given the rampant Mexican sentiment in Southern California, Mexican origin youth are really the ones that bear the brunt of a lot of these practices. And so, you know, in Pacific Colony, different studies showed, and my own review of the admissions between 1927 to 1945 show that Mexican origin youth represent 20% of admissions and confinement during a period when their population is kind of estimated to be between 6.5% and 8%. The second step was eugenic sterilization, and so in California, being confined in a state institution was the first step. The law empowered institutional authorities to sterilize folks in institutions without consent. And so my analysis of over 2,000 sterilization requests processed by Pacific Colony show that Mexican origin youth made up 25% of those requests. And the last way that this theory gets implemented is through labor. And this effort to make people labeled feeble-minded productive, despite these assertions that they were kind of incompetent, right? And so residents sustained the institution through their unpaid labor, cooking, cleaning, even caring for other folks in institutions. And the institution also develops this practice of vocational training and industrial parole, where people would be kind of leased out to serve as domestics in people's houses, as ranch hands to work in sanitariums and hospitals, as kind of low-paid, you know, quote, unskilled labor. And I think this last practice really shows us the very limited vision that eugenicists had for people that they categorize as unfit, right? They're not deserving of bodily or reproductive autonomy, but they can certainly be exploited as cheap labor. And so, you know, in thinking about the legacies, we can point to the many instances of sterilization abuse that occur after what's, you know, deemed the kind of eugenics period, right? So this long, massive sterilization campaign waged on the island of Puerto Rico, which some scholars estimate left 1 in 3 women on the island sterilized. We can trace the eugenic logic into the post-World War II period and its rebranding through the population control movement in federal family planning programs that really push birth control as poverty prevention, and then winds up resulting in a number of high-profile lawsuits. We have Ralph V. Weinberger, Madrigal versus Killigan, and then investigations of sterilization abuse at Indian Health Services. We can certainly trace eugenic logics into contemporary abuses like the ones that we learned about yesterday in Kelly Dillon's lived experience. Hundreds of women sterilized at California prisons. Immigrants facing unwanted and unnecessary hysterectomies at ICE detention centers, and this consistent use of sterilization and imprisonment as a means of reproductive oppression for people who are deemed not worth saving, right? And so in my kind of original plan for this, wrapping up this talk, I was gonna talk a bit about Trump and Musk's use of IQ and natural genius and references to good genes to kind of rationalize all types of things. But I actually was inspired yesterday to really instead and by highlighting the words of survivors of eugenic sterilization and institutionalization, because I think they really point us to the work that's to be done. And so the first 2 quotes come from a study that interviewed folks that were confined in Pacific Colony and sterilized at Pacific Colony but are unnamed. And they say they had no right to do that to me, right? Asserting their, you know, bodily autonomy. That they shouldn't do that to people just because they're in hospital, right? That disability labels and people's conditions of confinement shouldn't determine their reproductive capacity. And this last quote comes from one of the plaintiffs of the Madrigal versus Killigan case, which was a case wherein Mexican origin women sued the USC LA County Hospital for being sterilized while giving birth in the 70s. And Consuelo Hermosillo says, in another really wonderful documentary, No Más Bebés, they should never do that, no matter if they are on welfare. And so I think these quotes really echo a deep investment in the reproductive rights and bodily autonomy of everyone, despite their disability status, despite their socioeconomic position, and begin to offer us an anti-eugenic framework from which to start to imagine a different future. And so I look forward to those conversations as they develop later today. Thank you. Leave this on?
Okay, it's time for questions. I have a lot of questions for this panel, but I'm going to hold back. Please be as succinct as possible so we can hear from the maximum number of people. Yes, sir. Oh, yeah, wait for the mic, because this is being live cast.
She left. So, Dr. Hogarth, I was going to ask her a
Oh,
question.
Rana, you want to hold your question?
Yes.
Hold all the Rana questions. And who's next? Here. Oh, over here. Okay. Down here, Tom. Sorry. You're going to be running up and down, man.
It's good for me.
Did you do your East Rock hike today, or?
It's still icy on the trails.
Hi, thank you to all of the panelists. I do not have a question. I have a comment that I've been thinking about for a few years. So based on Evelynn and Rana's presentation, I thought about, Evelynn, when you posted some of the quotations from that very famous 2016 study from UVA, and I think probably every Black historian of race and medicine, we utilize that because it's so resonant. But so the study takes place with Hoffman and her team in 2014, and at UVA, as we all know, it's very prestigious. And this is the thing that I've been thinking about. These are medical students and residents, and so they have to take an MCAT. At UVA, the median MCAT score is 515, which is in the 94th percentile. These are people coming in with almost 4.0s. For all of us who are professors and we teach these students, they suspend whatever scientific training and knowledge they received over 4 years to take an MCAT test where they will not betray that scientific training. But as soon as someone comes in with an anonymous survey, they then all of a sudden have this intense investment in anti-Blackness, right? And so that's the thing. They know better because there are no science books that are saying these things in the 21st century. And so for me, it is really about going to what Rana talked about in the 19th century, this kind of racial cognitive dissonance, that even when she mentioned Yale invites Frederick Hoffman to present not a talk, but lectures, plural, knowing that his theories were disproved around Negro extinction. And so it really, for me, is just this kind of, what is the investment in the racial cognitive dissonance for people who suspend it when they are cloaked with anonymity?
I think that's an absolutely incredible and important question, because I think that these ideas are taught to them, to medical students, as you refer to in the UVA study. They're taught in an indirect way, right? And I think it's this constant, headlines in the newspapers every day. African Americans have higher rates of COVID. Must be something about the fact that they're racial, whatever. And it doesn't have to even get specific. And so that constant information about, Black women have higher rates of endometriosis, maternal morbidity and mortality. It's circulating. And so in the medical school context, from what I've seen, we've been trying to deal with this in various curricular ways at Harvard Medical School and Harvard School of Public Health, and I'm sure many other people are as well, to bring the students back to the specifics. Where did that come from? But see, that part of where it came from has been so sidelined in their education for so long. It's easy for them to fall back on the popular, and the popular and common sense notions of racial difference are so powerful and never been challenged by the kind of education that they've had so far. If they've never taken a history of medicine class, if they've never read Hoffman, they've never read Du Bois, and they've never read, most of my students don't even know what the Journal of the National Medical Association is and realize there was a black medical association because black people couldn't join the AMA. They don't know any of that. So what they resort to is, it makes sense. It makes sense. It's not dissonance, actually. Deirdre. I don't think it's too familiar to be dissonant. So to say that black bodies and white bodies are fundamentally, innately different makes sense. To question that is the thing that doesn't make sense. And so when I give my talks, a lot of times the medical students can get real hostile. Well, you know that, Ashkenazi Jews have a certain particular kind of genetic predisposition to certain kinds of breast cancer. And I go, yes. And that can be explained in many, many ways, in the details of that. But it folds right into, that idea is folded right into the idea, so bodies are different. And I've never argued that bodies aren't different. It's that, what does the difference mean?
Yeah.
And that's where you get hung up.
Let's take the first Rana question, which was right here.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Hogarth. This question, I think, is for you. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, we got you.
I apologize for saying that I'm an oral medicinist from McGill, retired. And I say that only because nobody knows what oral medicine is, but it's oral lesions of the mouth and so forth. So I'd like to get your response to something. I was lucky enough to listen to a PBS program where a black dermatologist was saying that she was starting a clinic for black patients at UCSF because many of the white dermatologists never see a lot of black patients, and the textbooks that are written don't have very many lesions of black patients. And so she felt that they were handicapped by diagnosis, diagnostically handicapped, I guess, and the patients were therefore handicapped by a misdiagnosis. So I called her and told her I would send her my 40-year collection of lesions from black patients that may be useful for her in both her teaching and her publication. So I'd just like to get your response to that.
So, can you hear me okay? So thank you so much for your question and for actually bringing up something that I think has to do with the kind of blurred lines between inadequate preparation and training in which black people's bodies and complaints have been invisible, and how medical textbooks and medical diagnosis has moved forward, and sort of the idea of embodied differences. So I certainly can appreciate the fact that if we look at textbooks and we look at sort of who the ideal patient is, the assumption has been to go towards whiteness. And I think particularly in looking for screening, for example, for skin cancers, for looking at differences in moles and changes like that has been inadequately addressed for people of color with darker pigmentation. So I definitely see the point in which if you're going to administer dermatological care for a whole patient population, you should familiarize yourself with all of the gradations and shades of skin color. Clearly there has been a failure to do that. I think that in the sense though, and I would be curious to hear more, if there is a suggestion that there's some kind of deeply embodied difference. Like, so that would be my question, like, are people suggesting that black people or their skin is sort of like some kind of an innate racial difference? And I think that in reality, I mean, we don't have this kind of time. I can talk to you about the history of the black epidermis, the idea of the rita mucosa, the attempts to find the mythical membrane that supposedly holds the pigment, the numerous cases of skin dissection, of saving actual skins of black people to kind of debate and figure out the intricacies and nature of that, which I think was, of course, a representation of the scientific impulse to see difference rather than anything super productive. The reality is that we all have the dermal layers. I'm not a dermatologist, but I understand that there are the different layers of skin.
that pigment is manifest in it differently does not necessarily accord to or validate a specific concept of a biological racial difference, because race itself is the category that is arbitrary. So just because you can classify people into the racial groups that we do, it's not required. It's actually completely arbitrary if we are to look at the work of Blumenbach, who has bequeathed to us the racial categorization system we still use. So I'd be curious to see more about whether or not this idea of sharing, which I think is a good idea to enhance the knowledge base around specifically attentiveness to what has been neglected for Black people with respect to proper dermatological care, versus suggesting that there's an idea that, well, this is because there's an innate difference. So I thank you for your comment.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Thank you. My question is for Evelynn. You mentioned this work you're doing on the comparative racial analysis in medical journals, like up basically through the present. And in my own work looking at the history of racial analysis of psychometrics, you look at more recent scientific publications on that. There's basically these are the result of a coordinated campaign of white supremacists trying to launder their ideology into scientific publications through journals they control and other such. So I'm curious as to, when you're looking at these these medical journals and the sort of more physiological studies and such, do you see any of that happening too, or is it more just sort of an expression of a deep-seated sort of implicit racism that's just more diffuse and cultural, as opposed to an explicit racist agenda on the part of researchers or funders or whatnot?
Yeah, it's important to think about specific times. Okay, so I think there's been, if you look in the early 20th century, you'll see, of course you've seen the sort of a white supremacist kind of focus, and it's quite explicit. That goes away to a certain extent, but in its explicitness. But what stays is the question that, we know that this difference, whatever the difference is, occurs, and it's real, and we can see it. And, the people who say it's not an innate racial quality are the people who just don't want to face the truth. And that ebbs and flows over time, post-1950, of course. And then one of the things that was an impetus for the National Academy of Sciences and the National Academy of Medicine to do these reports in the last few years is because that has become so confused and so complicated. And people are concerned about this new perspective that's largely manifested itself on social media, and of that this is about racial purity issues. Mm-hmm. And so they're trying to get the entire scientific and medical community to begin thinking hard about how this stuff emerged, where it came from, because this new impulse toward racial purity conversations is people consider to be quite dangerous and quite serious and quite harmful in its impact. So, but I think for most of this, you always can find some outliers who found avenues to publish, but they weren't in the major journals necessarily. So the American Journal of Public Health is starting a review of their volumes starting in the early 20th century. The Lancet has had many attempts to do this and it's been really complicated. JAMA is starting a project. And so this will reveal how these ideas were played out, whether if I'm right about saying there's been an indirect kind of approach to deal with race. But just as I quoted, the guy in JAMA said, we have thousands and thousands of these comparisons, but we can't even define race. Mm-hmm. So what are we talking about?
Next question over here on the edge. We got two of them over here. I have a question too. I hope I get to ask it.
Thank you. My question is for Dr. Lira. I was just wondering if your research or covered or looked into kind of the the modern sterilizations that are happening under conservatorships, because I know that a lot of people were not aware of that and only became aware of the fact that when the Britney Spears case became publicized, and it was that she couldn't remove her IUD, and just that kind of concept of the forced taking of birth control. Because that was certainly the first time that I became aware of that, and the fact that you could sterilize somebody that you had, if you were in a conservatorship with minimal justification from outside of just you and a judge. So yeah, that's my question.
So my research doesn't cover that, but I will say that the 1927 Buck v. Bell Supreme Court case still stands, and so a lot of states still do allow for sterilizations, particularly for people with disabilities, and it's kind of done in secret. And so there's actually this really wonderful podcast that I'm blanking on the name of the episode on where this legal scholar actually calls, I think it's the state of Virginia, court to ask how to go about sterilizing his child who has a disability, and the person who answers the phone is like, oh, this happens all the time, like, no worries, like, I'll send you the information. And so it's still definitely something that happens, even though a lot of states have overturned their specific eugenic sterilization laws, because eugenic sterilizations occurred on it wasn't a federal law. Like, the only federal thing that we have is the Supreme Court case, which allowed states to pass their own laws. So a lot of states have repealed their specific eugenic sterilization laws, but Buck v. Bell stands, and so that's really what's enabling these sterilizations to proceed. And there are organizations that are tracking that, but no, I haven't really looked into it.
Thank you.
Hello. My name is Danielle, and I'm a community member. But I think, thank you. And I think one of the things that I was pondering on is something that I want to say Dr. Evelynn had talked about, of just like the mythology of Black women and endometriosis. So that one kind of hit home because I do have endometriosis, and that is a rhetoric that had been explained to me for probably over 20 years, and I never actually received any help until maybe 3 or 4 years ago. So what for just people that are going for their own medical aid and wanting to know what is the real ideology on how to help themselves, where would you suggest someone that may not even be into high academia? I mean, I actually am an academic, but for somebody that is just a latent person and wants to know more about their diagnoses but is trying to shift through these things, where will we even be able to tell people to go? Are there journals specifically for just the average person to go and look at that, or is it just really just minefielting?
I think I love the question because for most Black women going into the medical world, there are so many aspects of this that are repeated over and over again, being questioned about all kinds of diseases, endometriosis, breast cancer, fibroids, cysts, all kinds of things. And I wouldn't say, maybe Gilder can answer this better. One site you would recommend that people go to?
Endometriosis Summit. It's on IG, and they have yearly conferences by some of the leading professionals in the field. So Endometriosis Summit.
Endometriosis Summit?
Yes.
SMMU. Summit. Okay.
You can go and follow them on Instagram, and it's a bunch of educative reels, videos. I've done a conference with them, and they try to dismantle a lot of those mythologies that Professor Hammond spoke about.
I don't know if our online audience could hear that, but the site is Endometriosis Summit for information for anyone.
On Instagram.
It's on Instagram. Of course, that matters. I have a question. I want to take us back to the 19th century. And Natalie, I mean, you may or may not covered this with your research, but this growth of IQ, the use of disability, and then Rana, you talked about the connections between all that pro-slavery ideology and then racial science. And I'm always trying to convey this to students because it's such an unsavory subject. But the just depth, and you know this from your book, but the depth of pro-slavery ideology before the Civil War, before emancipation. On the eve of the Civil War, 1859, I think it is, 2 huge volumes were published of pro-slavery writings, and they ranged from everything from biblical justifications to economic justifications to, frankly, very utopian writings about how slavery was the perfection of labor, and on and on and on. Many of them rooted in this kind of naturalization of race. It's such a huge body of writing and work. And then you start, and I mean, Osagi used the term, I think, baked into the culture. Evelynn, you used normalization. I mean, we can't overestimate how much this was baked in by this kind of ideology. And the scientists are clearly reading that stuff. They're reading that stuff too. No?
So I will be brief so you can also chime in here. But there's 2 things that I would say. So I have, because of my previous work with Benjamin Rush, who was an abolitionist and opposed to slavery, I've come to kind of swap out pro-slavery with anti-black. Because I think there are a lot of people, particularly in the North, and that's particularly why I focus so much on the Union Army study, to suggest that you can chew gum and walk at the same time. You can be opposed to slavery and also think that black people are not equal, that their bodies are different. And so I want to shout out some of the work from some younger colleagues. Christopher Willoughby's work, Masters of Health, actually explains very crisply and clearly how Northern medical schools were, training Southern physicians, were all trafficking in this kind of ideas. There are folks that would say, well, I'm not necessarily a polygenicist, but I certainly don't think black and white people are the same. Like, they're willing to accept that. They'll throw out other things. There's the idea of, we're having sectionalist crises, we're having this tension. How do we feel about the Confederacy? Well, I'm still going to cite Josiah Nott, who is one of the most rabid pro-slavery, anti-black racial theorists that ever existed, who was a product of the University of Pennsylvania. So it's one of those things where I've often tried to tell my students that it's, yes, there is clearly we have to focus on slavery, but we also have to bear in mind that anti-blackness can thrive and exist when we're not talking about slavery, and it's kind of, still there.
I would 100% agree. So the paper that we just finished on John Collins Warren at Harvard Medical School was, he's always been written about as if he, founder of the New England Journal, founder of what was then called Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, of course. And his general statements, we've read a lot of his lectures and everything. He does not take any kind of public stand being an abolitionist, or he doesn't want to talk so much about whether or not he's pro-slavery or not, but he wants to talk about racial difference, and he lectures about it all the time, and he dissects black bodies of enslaved people and free people and all kinds of folks, because that, to him, that foundational aspect of anatomical work was one way to prove the hierarchy of races, and he saw that as supremely important, and he also wanted to use that issue of difference to expand the national community of physicians. So lots of Southern students were going north, as Chris Willoughby shows, and they're being welcomed, and they talk about these kinds of things because and so they try to not create disunity. They're actually using racial difference and anti-blackness to create unity.
And race is always about perception, as you said. Just a quick footnote to that. There have been lots of studies now of the vast, millions of letters by Civil War soldiers. These white Northerners who get into the South for the first time in their lives, and they see vast numbers of black people. They can't stop writing about the variations of color. They just can't stop writing about that. And they see slaves who look white, and they can't stop writing about that. So it shows how embedded these perceptions were in common people. It's become an interesting source about racial attitudes, reading these kinds of letters. We can take at least one more question. Or yes, over here. Or where are we at? Here we go, right there.
Thank you. I guess this is for Natalie. It seems like sterilizing men would be so much easier than sterilizing women. Could you explain why this is perpetrated upon women?
Yes.
Line up, guys?
Well, interestingly, and I, don't talk about this in the presentation. presentation, but men were the first to be, like, the vasectomy was the first sterilization procedure. So men were sterilized, and were actually about half, young men were actually about half of the population that were sterilized in Pacific Colony. So, you know, I think there are lots of ways we could theorize why, like, after the 1950s and into, like, the sterilizations that occurred under, like, federally funded programs in the 70s and late 60s, like, women become the target, because there is really this campaign around that's disguised in a rhetoric of, like, giving women power to determine the size of their families, but that's really about, like, addressing poverty through birth control. And so it's really focused on women, and surprisingly, like, increasing access to contraception, which just was illegal in a lot of states, but under, like, population control arguments, those seem like a great idea. And so that's really kind of how that shift, I think, happens from sterilizing men to mostly sterilizing women.
Mm-hmm. We got one right back here in the aisle. There are plenty of seats here, by the way, if you don't want to sit in the aisles.
Yeah, I just didn't want to cross in front of anyone. So I wasn't here for the presentation, but I have a question regarding something that's called malingering that was sometimes commonplace throughout the antebellum South, where slaves would play up to stereotypes of what intelligence looks like, and so people would assume disability, and that was a way to claim bodily autonomy. So I wanted to ask you if anyone, if their research has related to that.
You should be familiar with Jennifer Barclay's work on the mark of slavery, which is particularly about slavery and disability. But I would also say, depending upon what your source material is like, malingering, disassembling has often been recognized as a form of resistance, as a form of kind of purposefully trying to gum up the works, if you like. So it's an interesting, and I'm not suggesting this as a research paper, but it would be quite interesting to think about the ways in which, like, the politics of ability and disability can become marshaled as a form of a specific kind of resistance, depending upon the historical context that you're looking at, and of course what the sources necessarily draw you to. But I would most certainly say you need to look at The Mark of Slavery. It's a really great book.
Tom, we've got
Can I
one
just
right
add
here.
really
Go
quickly
ahead.
to that? I also would recommend Joanna Schoen's work on sterilization in North Carolina, because she finds in her research that people would, like, have themselves committed to institutions to access sterilization, because it was the only way that they could access it.
Thank you for these really interesting talks. I was curious if you could talk about how abortion fits into the history of eugenics and sterilization.
Who's first?
So Davenport wasn't going around suggesting abortions. I can say that. In terms of, like, white eugenicists, like Charles Davenport, who I studied, was not running around saying, okay, I'm pro-abortions. That much I know because I've looked at his papers. I have yet to find him championing that kind of particular approach. I will leave it to others just if they have more.
Yeah, my sense is eugenicists were largely, like, pronatalist.
Pronatalist for white people.
For white people, yes, yes.
There is a case of the Hazelton baby, though, so if you are truly interested in this, so Marty Pernick has written about the Black Stork. It's also a terribly disturbing and awful film, but essentially it is about the Hazelton baby. This is a case of a child that was born and allowed to die. This was based in Chicago in the early 20th century. What I would say, though, is to kind of look through and see what Hazelton's view, he's the physician who actually championed this idea, what kind of language he had around the idea of should these children have even been born in the first place. The child in question had been born with severe birth defects. It may have been like sort of exaggerated for Hazelden, who also used this as an opportunity to embellish his reputation. But it's called The Black Stork. It's by Martin Pernick. And I think if you'd like more concrete information about potentials for abortion or that kind of attitude, that might be a good place to look.
I think we have run out of time on this session. I see a couple more hands, but there will be.
I'm just going to say on this point,
Sure.
a place where eugenics
I wish you had the mic, but that's okay.
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
A place where you do see abortion being listed is the positive eugenicists at the end of the 1930s. They put out something either called the Geneticist Manifesto or the Eugenics Manifesto, and they do put abortion in that as a list of techniques.
Thank you. We're going to have a coffee break now for about 15 minutes. It's upstairs in the common room, second floor. We'll be back here at 11:30 if we can force you. Thank you. Oh, yeah.